Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to EFSA's webinar on confidentiality for applicants. My name is Simone Gabbi, and I'm a team leader for confidentiality and transparency at the European Food Safety Authority Legal and Assurance Services Unit. This webinar is part of a broader series of training opportunities that has been granted and organized by the European Food Safety Authority in the context of the implementation of the Transparency Regulation. The webinar is dedicated and focusing on the submission and processing of confidentiality requests by applicants. Will last for approximately 1 hour. I will start with a brief introduction and provide the outline for the webinar. I will then move on to describe the applicable procedure and the requirements that have to be complied with by the applicants while submitting confidentiality requests. Caroline Fabre from the European Commission consultants will provide and give you a presentation and video on how to submit confidentiality requests in the e-submission food chain platform managed by DG Santé of the European Commission. Then Chiara Macchi from EFSA will provide a presentation regarding the same within the IUCLID software portal and package. We will then conclude with Sorina Puyu, who will give and show a video on the confidentiality request submission on Portalino. And then I will wrap up and identify some take-home messages before 12 o'clock. In terms of housekeeping rules, please note this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on EFSA's webpage dedicated to training opportunities in the context of the implementation of the Transparency Regulation a few days after today. The webinar is held in English only. There is no translation or dubbing, and questions may be posed only in English and will reply to in this language. Please note that this is a one-way audio and you're connected in listening mode only. You have, however, the opportunity to interact with us at any moment in time during this 1 hour webinar with this Q&A feature that is available on your screen. You may ask questions at any time during this webinar by using the dedicated chat. Please provide a nickname and the context of your question, possibly also the reference to the slide or the topic that is being related to. We have a team of colleagues on standby ready to answer your questions. However, we can anticipate that given the number of participants that is in excess of 500, we will be not in a position to answer to all questions. In addition, please also note that we will not reply, address, or publish abusive questions or questions that do not relate to the topic discussed in this webinar. In terms of background to this webinar, we have to consider the Transparency Regulation and the reason why it was adopted by the Union legislators. The Transparency Regulation is a response of the Union legislators to also a European Citizens Initiative that regarded the plant protection product and asked for the increase in transparency in the risk analysis process file. However, the Transparency Regulation went further than that. It adopted a series of measures that are aimed at increasing the overall transparency of the risk assessment process applicable to all Union Food Law Acts. This translates into new processes, including pre-submission advice, public consultations, notification of studies, and also extensive proactive disclosure requirements. We will now be focusing on this particular part of the Transparency Regulation due to its relevance for confidentiality decision-making. The Transparency Regulation requires EFSA to proactively publish all information, data, documents that it receives as supporting application dossiers submitted to its attention for scientific evaluation. It also requires EFSA to make proactively available all information, documents, and data that are supporting requests from the European Commission, European Parliament, and Member States, as well as all information on which EFSA bases its scientific outputs. Proactive disclosure will be made and will be on EFSA's open portal, which is a portal specifically devoted to the dissemination and disclosure of these documents, data, and information, and it is linked up to EFSA's corporate website. The information, documents, and studies that will be disclosed will be made available upon registration of the users and acceptance of terms of reference that clarify that disclosure of these documents, information, and studies is without prejudice to pre-existing rights and existing data protection clauses or data exclusivity clauses, as some call them. We have also to consider that the European Food Safety Authority, in its quality as Union decentralized agency, is required to implement the powers that are assigned explicitly to it by Union legislation and may not overstep its mandate. In this regard, EFSA, most notably, has no law enforcement powers or sanctioning powers. The exception to these proactive disclosure requirements that apply as soon as an application dossier is deemed valid or admissible, or as soon as a general mandate is accepted by EFSA, or as soon as a call for data is closed, the exception, I was saying, can be identified in the items that have been granted confidential status by EFSA, the Commission, or their member state, upon justified request by an applicant, or in the personal data belonging to certain categories as set out in Article 39E of Regulation 178/2002, as amended by the Transparency Regulation, or again, relate to scientific publications that are publicly available upon the payment of a fee and for which the applicant does not enjoy disseminating rights. All this to highlight the importance of a sound confidentiality request submission and sound confidentiality assessment process. Having clarified the background that led EFSA to organize this webinar, we can now move on to outline the key features of the confidentiality decision-making by EFSA. In this regard, we should first consider as a basis for the applicable requirements and procedure, the practical arrangements adopted by the European Food Safety Authority at the end of 2020, and that are publicly available on EFSA's website. EFSA adopted one set of practical arrangements concerning transparency and confidentiality, implementing Article 38(3) and 39(d)(5) of the General Food Law as amended by the Transparency Regulation, which provides the vast majority of the applicable provisions and procedures, as well as another set of practical arrangements concerning confidentiality in the context of the Plant Protection Product Regulation, which specifies the applicable procedure and requirements that are applicable specifically to confidentiality requests submitted in that context. This webinar is a webinar focusing on the confidentiality decision-making process that are applicable and handled by EFSA directly. Therefore, it does not touch upon confidentiality decision-making process by the rapporteur member state, by the European Commission, or by national authorities under the GM Deliberate Release Directive. In terms of the applicable procedural requirements that are identified in these practical arrangements that implement the Transparency Regulation, we have first to highlight that confidentiality requests may be submitted by applicants only at certain procedural steps that are identified in these practical arrangements. These are either together in the context of the submission of an application dossier by an applicant, or in response to a request for information that is triggered by the European Food Safety Authority, or again in the context of a call for data and the voluntary submission of a certain data set, or again in the context of the submission of information supporting a general mandate by the Commission, the Member States, or the European Parliament. The submission of this confidentiality request is to be made only via the IT tools indicated on EFSA's website. We will come back to this later, detailing and listing these IT tools and showing how in practice the submission of the confidentiality request is supposed to work. The confidentiality requests are only supposed to be made on certain parts or items of application dossiers or otherwise submitted information. And these items are part of closed positive list identified and set out in the Transparency Regulation. That is, either in the General Food Law as amended by the Transparency Regulation, now available in a consolidated form on EURLEX, or in the applicable Sectoral Legal Act amended by the Transparency Regulation. This also means that the submission of a confidentiality request on items that are not part of this positive list does not deserve a positive assessment by EFSA and will therefore be rejected. In this regard, it should be noted that EFSA does not dispose of any discretion on this point. It's also very important to highlight that the Transparency Regulation puts the burden of proof on the demonstration regarding the demonstration of the confidentiality request directly on the applicant's shoulders. This means that the applicants have to submit verifiable justification, and we will come back to this point on the next slide to exactly outline what this means in practice. Applicants are supposed to submit confidentiality requests in a complete form at the first moment when they submit the request, and are allowed to submit clarifications or modify the submitted confidentiality request only when requested to do so by EFSA. The clarifications are to be submitted by the timeline indicated by EFSA, and failure to do so will result in the rejection of the confidentiality request, as EFSA will have to proceed in the assessment of the confidentiality request with the information already available to it in the first place. To be noted that EFSA is not levying fees on that are supposed to be covering the costs for the assessment or processing of confidentiality requests. We anticipated that the applicant is required to submit a verifiable justification with regard to each and every confidentiality request. In this respect, the applicant is asked to identify clearly the information that is claimed to be confidential, whenever possible indicating the exact references, points in the relevant documents, and also links to these documents. This is meant to facilitate the processing of the confidentiality request, but also and especially the process of implementing a decision on confidentiality and the ensuing reduction or sanitization. Please also indicate the exact legal basis for each and every confidentiality request. And for this, we mean the actual grounds that are to be indicated. And by grounds, we mean the specific item on the basis of which the confidentiality request is made. In other words, the item in the closed positive list, identified in Article 39 of the General Food Law or in the relevant provision in the sectoral legal acts. Furthermore, and more importantly, please also explain why you consider that the item should be kept confidential. Bear in mind, the applicants carry the burden of proof in this regard. And EFSA requires applicants to clarify and confirm that the information claimed to be confidential is not publicly available, because the public availability of the information claimed to be confidential, unless it's stolen, obviously, and disclosed in an unlawful manner, would automatically imply the rejection of the confidentiality request. Please also confirm that the disclosure of these elements, claimed to be confidential, would result in a potential harm to the applicant to a significant degree, by confirming that the information in question has been acquired in a legitimate manner, that is, not in an unlawful manner, has not been stolen, for instance. Please also confirm compliance with two rebuttable presumptions regarding the negligible harm and the novelty of the information claimed to be confidential. In this respect, the applicant is asked to confirm the rebuttable presumption that the disclosure of the information claimed to be confidential will result in a harm corresponding to at least 5% of the annual turnover or annual earnings for natural persons of the year preceding the submission of the confidentiality request. If the applicant is not in a position to provide this confirmation, they will have to confirm and provide a more detailed justification as to why the potential harm test is still met if the item in question is disclosed. Similarly, the applicant will have to confirm compliance with the novelty rebuttable presumption by confirming that the information claimed to be confidential is not older than 5 years prior to the submission of a confidentiality request. Again, also for this rebuttable presumption, in case the applicant is unable to provide this confirmation, they will have to explain the reason why the disclosure would result in a potential harm to a significant degree, even if the information is older than 5 years. More information may be found on these aspects on EFSA's practical arrangements and Q&A documents. Also, last but not least, the applicant is required to clarify that the information claimed to be confidential belongs or does not belong to the concept of environmental information as defined in the AROS regulation of the European Union. Now, once a confidentiality request is submitted by using the appropriate tool and by providing the requested set of information, the EFSA will assess the confidentiality request and will draft a confidentiality decision. It then will proceed to the sharing of this draft confidentiality decision with the applicant by giving them 2 weeks' time to provide their comments on the draft decision. By this timeline, in alternative to providing comments, obviously, the applicant is also in a position not to comment, not to react, or to withdraw their application. Assuming that the withdrawal of the application is not made, EFSA will then proceed at the end of this timeline with the finalization and signature of the final decision after having taken into account the applicant's comments. Once the final decision on confidentiality is submitted to the applicant's attention, the applicant will have the possibility to file a confirmatory application during a 2 weeks timeline by writing an email, possibly also with attachments, to the attention of EFSA's Executive Director to the functional mailbox indicated on this slide, confidentiality confirmatory application at efsa.europa.eu. EFSA will then be taking a decision on the confirmatory application and will be doing so by tasking staff not involved in the decision-making process leading to the first decision that is under review in the context of the confirmatory application. This is in compliance with the impartiality principle set out in the General Food Law, amended by the Transparency Regulation, as well as in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. However, please note that in case EFSA awards and confirms confidentiality status to certain items, it may still be reviewing such a decision in case it adopts a scientific output identifying foreseeable effects on human health, animal health, or the environment. And these effects relate to the items that have been granted confidential status. In this case, EFSA will be reopening the decision-making process and therefore will start a new assessment, provide a draft decision to the applicants for comment, will be then finalizing the decision after the timeline of consultation, and then will be signing off the decision. And this will include also the possibility for the applicant to bring forward a confirmatory application against the final decision on the reviewing the initial set of decisions. Once the decision-making process is over, the applicant will have the possibility to challenge the legality of the decision on the confirmatory application by lodging a case before the General Court of the EU at the conditions set out in Article 263 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. To be noted that this legal remedy is available only against the decision on the confirmatory application as per the Transparency Regulation. In the alternative, the applicant will also be in a position to lodge a complaint to the attention of the European Ombudsman, although obviously this is, strictly speaking, not having the same effect as a court case before the General Court, as it's not, strictly speaking, a legal remedy. In case the decision is not challenged before the General Court, EFSA will then be proceeding with implementation of its confidentiality decision, identifying or rejecting confidentiality requests that are made by the applicants. In this case there is a discrepancy between EFSA's confidentiality decision and the initial confidentiality request of the applicant, EFSA will have to sanitize or redact the information datasets documents provided by the applicants in accordance with its confidentiality decision. EFSA may also share the sanitized version of the documents, datasets, or information with the applicant for verification. That is, in order to verify that no clerical mistakes have been made in the implementation of the decision. However, this is not a requirement, nor it is a way to reopen the confidentiality decision-making process or allow the applicant to submit another set of confidentiality requests. Following the sanitization process, the sanitized documents will be then put on EFSA's open portal at the earliest 2 weeks after the notification of the confidentiality decision. For dossiers submitted by Euclid, the sanitization will be delegated to the applicant themselves until the Euclid software is amended, is changed in order to allow the direct intervention of the European Food Safety Authority or the rapporteur member state on the dossier submitted by the applicant. The possibility for an applicant to withdraw an application dossier exists, as we anticipated, in the context of the mandatory consultation on draft confidentiality decision. It exists and persists, however, also later, after this moment in time, and in particular prior to the adoption of our confidentiality decision. In case the withdrawal of the application dossier is made before a confidentiality decision is taken by EFSA, the rapporteur member state, the national authorities, and the Commission will have to comply with the confidentiality decisions as initially made by the applicant, and will also proceed to the deletion of information already made publicly available on EFSA's open portal. This withdrawal of application dossiers may also occur after the adoption of the confidentiality decision in case and when the decision has not been implemented. And in this event, desanitization or redaction will be put on hold and EFSA will proceed with the deletion of the already published data. If instead desanitization has been already made and desanitized documents have already been disseminated, EFSA will simply be deleting the information made already publicly available on the OpenEFSA portal, although it cannot provide any reassurance about the ultimate deletion of all the versions that may have been stored elsewhere on the internet. Now, we have seen just now the requirements that are applicable and the procedural steps that are applicable to the submission and processing of confidentiality requests. We're now shifting to the practical submission of the request. As anticipated, the practical submission of the confidentiality request has to be made via free IT tools that reflect the different patterns and means of submission of application dossiers or scientific information to EFSA's attention. The majority of the application dossiers regarding regulated products that are submitted to EFSA's attention for evaluation are to be sent to EFSA via the e-submission food chain platform managed by DG Sante of the European Commission. And also, confidentiality requests regarding those dossiers have to be submitted by using that platform while submitting the application dossiers themselves. For what concerns application dossiers on active substances, basic substances, microorganisms, maximum residue levels for plant protection products, instead, applicants will have to do the submission of the application as well as the submission of confidentiality requests by using the IUCLID platform for pesticides. Last but not least, the dossiers that are to be submitted by not using and are not covered by the first two portals will have to be submitted by using a proprietary tool developed by EFSA nicknamed Portalino that will be also to be used for the submission of confidentiality requests by participants to open call for data in case a confidentiality request must be made, as well as to business operators and applicants who are submitting confidentiality requests regarding information used by the Commission, the Parliament, or the Member States for submitting a generic mandate under Article 29 of the General Food Law. Following the submission of the confidentiality request, EFSA will proceed with the assessment and decision making as outlined before, and in case it disagrees with one of the confidentiality requests with the applicant provided by the applicants, will proceed to the sanitization and publication of the sanitized documents on the OpenEFSA portal. This is what I wanted to convey in terms of applicable requirements and procedural steps. I now pass the floor to Caroline for an outline and video regarding the submission of the confidentiality request with the Commission platform. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simone, and good morning, everyone. So my name is Caroline Pham. I'm the project manager of the e-submission food chain platform. I'm working as a consultant for the European Commission and more specifically for DG Sante, the Directorate General for Health and Food Safety. I'm here today to present you a short video to explain how the applicants will be able to submit a confidentiality request and how they will follow the progress and interact with EFSA through the ESFC platform during the confidentiality process review. I will now share the video.
How the applicant enters confidentiality requests for documents uploaded into the e-submission food chain platform. To support a dossier through the risk assessment, the applicant will need to provide complete and unedited information. Some documents will need no request for confidentiality at all, so these will not enter the confidentiality process. The applicant may consider other documents to contain confidential elements which will require confidentiality treatment. All documents flagged as non-confidential will be automatically disseminated on the Open EFSA portal once the dossier is considered valid. That point of validation also starts EFSA's confidentiality assessment process for all the other documents for which the applicant has requested confidentiality treatment. Let's assume you are the applicant and you want to add a confidential document. Despite the fact that the badge shows by default non-confidential, first upload the confidential and unredacted document version. Browse to and upload your document, then define the document type. Then click the three dots to request confidentiality treatment. At that moment the status switches to confidential. Information claimed to be confidential will not be disseminated unless EFSA takes a decision rejecting one or more confidentiality requests. Now explain your reasons for requesting confidentiality for each redacted information element. Click Add Confidential Ground to select one legal ground from the pull-down list. Remember, there is help available in every section. Provide a verifiable justification, the verbatim text excerpt of that information, and provide its document position in the related section field. Finally, you can select one or several applicable conditions that explain the disclosure risks for each selected confidentiality request. And there may be multiple requests in the same document. Now upload the non-confidential version of your confidential document, with any confidential elements digitally redacted and blacked out. This will be disseminated after dossier validation. If you would like to add a new document, click Add Document and follow the same procedure if you consider parts of it to be confidential. Once the dossier is ready, you can submit it. The dossier will be first received by the Commission or Member State competent authority, depending on the food sector, and it will be forwarded to EFSA for risk assessment. How EFSA receives confidentiality requests and when the confidentiality assessment process starts. As applicant, you will be informed by email notification and on the dossier overview when the dossier is valid. At that moment, EFSA can start the confidentiality request review. How the EFSA legal assessor and applicant interact together during the confidentiality process. If EFSA requires further information in order to make a decision, they will send a clarification to the applicant via the ESFC platform. Such clarifications on confidentiality requests are notified to the applicant by email and the bell icon. At that moment only, a confidentiality assessment tab appears, which simplifies for the applicant the follow-up of the confidentiality process on the ESFC. The applicant reads the clarification and responds with free text. No files can be uploaded. Click Reply and it is sent to EFSA. The pending badge switches to replied. EFSA considers whether the reply is suitable and makes a draft decision for that single confidentiality request. If the applicant doesn't reply to the request for clarification, EFSA will send the draft decision without having their input. This draft decision arrives in the dashboard, with the badges Agree or Not Agree. From the reception of the draft decision, the applicant has a further 2 weeks to state a view on each not agreed decision, beyond which the opportunity to comment is lost and the process continues. During the same period, the applicant may withdraw the entire dossier. This will effectively prevent the disclosure of elements claimed confidential, but will also terminate the evaluation procedure of the dossier. If the dossier has not been withdrawn, EFSA finalizes and signs a decision for each confidentiality request, taking into account the applicant's stated view, if any. If the applicant does not agree to EFSA's final decision, they have 2 weeks in which to submit a confirmatory application. The applicant must send an email to initiate this process, which currently takes place outside the ESFC platform. How EFSA informs the applicant of the sanitized version of the confidential document. the applicant will be notified by email and the bell icon. The document sanitized by EFSA will be accessible in the dossier in the relevant section and in the confidentiality assessment dashboard. If at least one confidentiality request is not agreed by EFSA, then the version of the document as provided by the applicant is sanitized by EFSA. That means the corresponding information from the confidential version of the document for that specific confidentiality request will be revealed. The document sanitized by EFSA will appear on the Open EFSA portal and will replace the non-confidential document version as provided by the applicant. If, however, all the confidentiality requests within one document are agreed, then the non-confidential version of the confidential document as submitted by the applicant will remain published on the Open EFSA portal. Confidentiality requests may be submitted by the applicant with regard to additional information provided by the applicant during the authorization process. In this event, the confidentiality requests will follow the same confidentiality process followed for those submitted on the initial dossier, if any. EFSA's practical arrangements provides more detail. How to handle publicly available documents, such as publications or studies, with intellectual property rights owned or not owned. Publicly available documents with IPR owned or not are not subject to confidentiality decision-making, as previously outlined, but rather to a veracity check of the information provided, and of the presence of the full and valid reference for the risk assessment. While the applicant cannot claim confidentiality on publicly available documents, IPR impacts all disclosures. The applicant will be required to state the IPR status of each document uploaded. The radial button by default is set to not publicly available. If the document the applicant wants to upload is public, but they don't own or cannot obtain the IPR for reproduction on EFSA's website, the applicant will have to select IPR not owned option. The applicant will be required to upload the full version that will not be disseminated, and to submit the relevant bibliographic references to these documents, indicating where they are available to the public for dissemination on the Open EFSA portal. If the document the applicant wants to upload is public, but they hold the IPR for reproduction on EFSA's website, the applicant will have to select IPR owned option. The applicant should provide the full version that will be disseminated on the Open EFSA portal, keeping in mind that publicly available documents cannot be claimed as confidential.
So I hope this video gave you a clear understanding of the confidentiality process within the ESFC platform. And now I will give the floor to Chiara Macchi, who will present the confidentiality process in Euclid. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Caroline. My name is Chiara Macchi, and I work for the Applications Desk unit here in EFSA, and I'm a member of the team implementing Euclid for pesticides. I will now share a few words on how confidentiality requests can be made in Euclid and how this subsequently impacts the publication of your data. As of entry into application of the Transparency Regulation, Euclid is the tool used for managing pesticide submissions. More specifically, in the pesticides context, Euclid is used for the following application types: active substances, both new and renewal, including microorganisms, basic substances, and MRL applications. Publishing from Euclid is a semi-automated process, and the underlying principle is that every field used in pesticide submissions has been assigned a preliminary filter rule. These filter rules determine whether the underlying information will be published or not. The Excel file with the filter rules currently implemented is available online. The hyperlink will be made available to you together with these slides. We will say more about the filter rules shortly, but here you have an example of the rules used in the literature entity in Euclid and how publication of every field will consequently be managed. As you can see, the level of granularity is literally at the level of every field within this entity. Currently, the following filter rules are mainly used within Euclid. Published, which as already mentioned by my colleagues previously, is the default rule and implies publication of this data with no possibility to do otherwise. And unless conf. This implies that the information is published unless claimed confidential. If claimed confidential, the information will not be published pending the outcome of the confidentiality assessment by EFSA or by the RMS, depending on the submission type. And if the claim is rejected, the flag must be changed and the underlying data will subsequently be published. As we saw from the screenshot in the previous slide, a small number of more sophisticated filter rules is used in specific cases. These are listed and described in a dedicated tab in the Filter Rules Excel, of which you just saw an extract, so it is consultable again online. The Dissemination Preview is a very useful Euclid functionality, which enables the applicant to simulate which information from their dossier is likely to be made publicly available by EFSA. The Dissemination Preview is run from a dossier and not a data set. This is very important. And the output is a file in Excel format. In order to run the Dissemination Preview, you must select the relevant dossier from the Euclid dashboard. This will bring you to the screen that you now see. You must select the 3 dots from the upper right-hand corner of the screen and then select Dissemination Preview from the drop-down menu. It is strongly recommended to use this tool before submitting a dossier in order to simulate which information will be published. In this screenshot, you see an extract of the output of the Dissemination Preview. As mentioned previously, it is yet again an Excel, from which a couple of columns have been hidden to keep the image size manageable. As you can see, you can view all the relevant information on each field, including the filtering outcome, i.e., will the data in that field be published or not? This is now, as opposed to the Excel you saw previously with the filter rules, which was generic, this is now run on a dossier, on your dossier, and therefore shows the specific output for your dossier with your data. Depending on your needs, you can either search for a particular section of the dossier, as I did previously on the literature reference, or you can copy the path for a specific field from the Euclid manual. In fact, in the Euclid manuals, you will not only find information on how to fill in a given section, but also the field path, which you can then verify against the Dissemination Preview file. A report will also be made available, listing for all information whether it was removed or left in the filtered dossier. So, claiming certain fields of confidential if they are subject to the unless conf filter rule. As you can see from the first image, you can set a confidentiality flag in the relevant Euclid entity, summary, record, or section. The red symbolizes in the first example that the flag has already been set in this case. Depending on the Euclid document you are in, the flag can be field specific, as in the first image, or can refer to a section, for example, the administrative data as flagged with number 2. When the flag refers to a section, the flag and the associated justification will apply to all the fields within that section for which the filter rule is set to unless conf. There are other sections in Euclid, for example, related to the composition of a substance or mixture, where several components are listed and they may be subject to different confidentiality needs and/or obligations. In this case, the flag can be selectively applied to each component within the repeatable block. So by clicking on the flag within your table, as you can see, in this case it's gray because it has not been set yet, you will open the justification form, which we will now look at in the next slide. So, you must fill in a justification for each confidentiality request, this is important, in compliance with the standards set out in the practical arrangements. Justifications for pesticide submissions must be submitted exclusively via Euclid, and a separate justification must be associated to each confidentiality request or flag. In the screenshot, you see the web form, which you will use for this confidentiality request. The first field is where you set the flag. You will have 3 options made available to you by the system. It is important that you select CBI, confidential business information, as this is the reason, since this is in alignment with the transparency regulation. The second block, which is actually the bulk of the web form, is where you provide the text of your justification. And then at the end, you will have the possibility to select the relevant regulatory program. An extensive list is made available by the system, and you should select EU PPP, as shown in the example. And this is it from me. I thank you for your attention, and I now pass the floor to Sorina Puiu.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sorina Puiu, and I'm a business analyst in the Transformation Services Unit in EFSA. In the next minutes, I invite you to watch together a video tutorial on the Portalino. The Portalino, it is the EFSA tool that enables applicants and business operators to request confidentiality for application, data sets, or scientific supporting documents that are out of scope of the e-submission food chain platform or Euclid, the platforms presented before for requesting confidentiality. In this video, you will see also the tag orphan dossier with the hashtag orphan dossier. We tagged as orphan dossiers the applications which will request confidentiality through the Portalino, since for the moment they are not supported by two dedicated platforms presented before. But more insights we can see together in the video.
The Portalino, which is an Italian diminutive for a portal, is the tool used by EFSA for receiving confidentiality requests related to datasets and documents supporting the mandates that EFSA receives and are not related to the applications for authorization of regulated products. Any data received via e-submission through the food chain platform, also known as FSCAP, or Euclid, are excluded from the scope of this tool. Some examples of the data subject to confidentiality requests submitted to EFSA through the Portalino: applications in the area of biological hazards and contaminants, such as animal byproducts, fertilizers, feed detoxification for chemical contaminant and high-risk plants. Additional datasets supporting inconclusive opinions in the area of feed additives, GMO. Food additives re-evaluation, calls for data in different areas. Applicants submitting application dossiers not covered by the e-submission food chain platform managed by the Commission or by Euclid must submit their confidentiality requests using the Portalino. Failure to do so will result in their application dossiers being made proactively available by EFSA in their entirety as soon as the application is deemed valid by EFSA. It's equally important that business operators sharing with EFSA information in the context of public calls for data or to support mandates submitted by the Commission, the Parliament or the Member States use the Portalino, if they wish to preserve some parts of this information from proactive disclosure requirements set out in the Transparency Regulation. The organizations and their contacts intending to submit confidentiality requests need to register in the EFSA Connect portal before accessing the Portalino. After logging in, the submitter lands on the overview page. All the submissions previously created are visible in a glance. Clicking on the New Submission button triggers the creation of a submission and the confidentiality requests linked to it, guiding the user step by step through the process. The first step requires the completion of the field subject of the submission, that will hold a brief description of the content of the submission. The description will allow EFSA to easily associate the submission with the related mandate and the submitter to quickly retrieve a specific submission if the overview list is longer. In the next step, the organization owning the data contained in the submission will be selected from a drop-down list. All the information related to the selected organization will be automatically filled in. The organization owning the data, if different from the organization submitting the confidentiality requests, also needs to be registered in the EFSA Connect portal. The next step in the procedure is the selection of the contact person. The tool will propose a drop-down list of all the contact persons of the organization performing the submission in the tool. The person selected from the list will receive via email all the communications related to the confidentiality decision-making process, triggered upon submitting the request. The last step allows the user to provide the details requested by the confidentiality decision-making process. The full version of the submission contains all the data and files meant to be used during the risk assessment process to which the submission is associated. The excerpts of the text linked with the confidentiality requests need to be earmarked in the documents. Earmarking method will facilitate the identification and the contextualization of each confidentiality request. All the files composing the full version, independently from their format, will be compressed in a zip file prior uploading it in the tool. The non-confidential version of the submission contains all the data and files that can be made public. The confidential extracts corresponding to the confidentiality requests will be already hidden. Each confidentiality request is a structured form containing fields that will allow detailing each request. File name fields requires the name of the file in the full version zip in which the request can be found. The confidentiality ground can be selected from a drop-down list. The justification must explain clearly the reasons why the information should be granted confidential status. The justification shall include explanation like related to the fact that the information is not publicly available or the public disclosure of the information may potentially harm the interests of the applicant. The excerpt of the text contains the extract to which the confidentiality request is related. It should correspond to an earmarked text in the file included in the full version of the submission. Related section contains the section of the information with regard to which the confidentiality request is made. The confidentiality conditions need to be selected. Additional requests, having the same structure, can be added. Submission can be saved as draft. Once completed, the Submit button will send the submission to EFSA. No further change will be allowed. An acknowledgement receipt of the confidentiality request will be sent to the contact person and the status of the submission is set to submitted. The confidentiality assessment decision-making process will start once EFSA associates the submission to a mandate. The status of the submission will become an evaluation. The communication between EFSA and the contact person associated with the submission will be managed out of the tool. The tool will only allow sharing documents created by EFSA in the different steps of the confidentiality assessment process. In this example, the initial draft decision, the decision on confidentiality request, the decision on the confirmatory application and the initial redacted version were already shared by EFSA. Also, the decision reviewing previously adopted decisions pursuant to Article 39C of the General Food Law has been already dispatched. Each document can be downloaded, consulted and any feedback can be provided to EFSA by email, out of the tool.
I hope you have found the video tutorial useful and clear for your future submissions. I thank you everybody, and I now pass the floor to my colleague Simone.
Thank you very much, Sorina. That was interesting. Now we are approaching the end of the webinar. I would like to identify some take-home messages for you that obviously do not summarize everything that was displayed or outlined, nor all the replies that were provided in the written chat. Let's say we can, however, identify some main messages here. First of all, if you submit information, datasets, documents to EFSA's attention, before you do so, please consider taking into account that it will be made proactively available by EFSA at the moment the application dossier is deemed valid or admissible, or the public consultation is closed, or the general mandate is accepted, or the scientific output is adopted, depending on the applicable process. So if you do not submit a confidentiality request, the entire dataset and information will be made proactively available on EFSA's Open EFSA portal. If you submit a confidentiality request, please do so by using the appropriate tool at the right procedural moment in time and by providing the requested content as we explained. Please also keep under monitoring your account in the relevant IT tool to react swiftly to requests for clarifications or consultations on the draft decisions. Please also consider the possibility of submitting a confirmatory application in case you're not satisfied with the outcome of the first confidentiality decision, because only by submitting a confirmatory application you will have the availability of a legal remedy as foreseen in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. This is in a nutshell the take-home messages that we identified. However, please do not limit your, let's say, your knowledge regarding confidentiality request submission and processing to what we discussed today. There is much more already out there. In this slide, we provide links to useful documents that are relevant in the context of the processing and submission of confidentiality requests. For instance, the document on the question and answers on all the EFSA practical arrangements, therefore covering notification of studies, pre-submission advice, public consultations, as well as confidentiality and transparency requirements. But also the administrative guidances that have been updated by EFSA in order to reflect the changes brought about by the transparency regulation, as well as the sectoral guidance documents, the training materials, including other video introduction tutorials and webinar recordings that are available on a dedicated page of EFSA's website, as well as the practical instructions and user manuals that are being developed for the IT tools in question. Last but not least, please take into account and read the practical arrangements that are applicable to the relevant process, in this case, those concerning transparency and confidentiality, and those concerning confidentiality in the context of the plant protection product regulation. You will find additional information and tools on the applications toolkit webpage that is available on EFSA's corporate website. I have now to acknowledge and thank all the colleagues and consultants who contributed to this webinar. Among EFSA staff, Natalie, Delphine, Matthias, Gunda, and Jane, who worked to reply to your questions in the Q&A chat, as well as the consultants Orca, Eduardo, and Eliana, who worked on the visual and video products. Therefore, I can only thank you for having attended and having participated actively to our webinar, and wish you a good continuation of the day. Please take a few minutes to fill out our evaluation form so that we can further improve our service. Again, goodbye. Thank you.